Thank you for that really interesting panel. I'm Catherine Schuster-Bruce, a journalist and medical doctor, and I'm here on stage with Amir Inamdar, who is the Chief Medical Officer at Cybin, and we're here to discuss the challenges in psychedelic drug development, some of which were covered in the previous panel just then. So the focus of today is to kind of talk about Europe's opportunity as a leader in the space. And we're going to talk about the challenges in getting there and how companies like Cybin are overcoming them. Samir is well qualified to speak on this topic. He initially trained as a psychiatrist and then spent 25 years working for big pharma, including for companies like GSK, AstraZeneca, and Takeda. So maybe just to start off with, we've got 20 minutes, maybe in a couple of sentences, just describe what you're up to at Cybin.
First of all, good morning. Great to be here with so many interesting colleagues working in the same field. At Cybin, as you said, I'm the Chief Medical Officer. My job is essentially to design the clinical programs, take the drugs through development onto registration, and I'm generally responsible for the patient safety in the clinical trials.
Amazing. And so how does it differ, doing what you're doing at Cybin, trying to attain marketing authorization for an antipsychotic? So previously you have obtained marketing authorization for an antipsychotic whilst you're at Takeda. How is it different for a psychedelic drug?
So the issues with psychedelics, they're not unique in terms of drug development. We see that with antipsychotics, there are other drugs which have such profound effects that patients can tell what they're on. But because these drugs are normally not taken on a daily basis, because they result in non-ordinary states of consciousness, because they always are provided with some sort of psychological support, that creates unique challenges in development of these drugs. Now, in drug development or in clinical research, the gold standard is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And because of the issues I mentioned earlier, it's virtually impossible to conduct a proper randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. So the work we are doing at Cybin, we basically come to the conclusion that, okay, we've got to accept that the traditional mold of a randomized controlled study will not work, and you have to make certain adaptations to that design, still within the regulatory framework. And we make certain adaptations to them, and that's how we are designing our clinical development program. And addressing some of the challenges that exist within drug development in this area. And there are many. For example, there are regulatory challenges. A typical drug development program, you mentioned an antipsychotic, lurasidone, which I worked on while I was at Takeda. A typical novel drug would require 2 short-term studies which are positive. You would require a study that demonstrates long-term durability of effect, a maintenance of effect study. You are required to demonstrate long-term safety. And there is a requirement for a typical safety database. People may be familiar with the ICH 1500 database. So you've got to demonstrate safety in at least 1500 patients, of which at least 300 must receive the drug for 6 months, and at least 100 must receive the drug for a year. Now, that's a challenge, right? These drugs are not given daily. So how do you assess long-term safety according to guidelines which have been designed for drugs to be administered daily? Maintenance of effect, right? A typical study which demonstrates maintenance of effect or durability is called as a randomized withdrawal study. You give patients drug, people who respond, half of them or some of them, you withdraw the treatment and see whether they relapse. So that relapse prevention study how do you do that with a drug that's not administered daily? I mean, there are other issues, of course, which the audience might be well aware of, and I think they're beaten to death with placebo effects and blinding. But some of the regulatory challenges are quite acute. Something that people don't really talk about often is the set of non-clinical studies that you need to do to get into the clinic. So as you know, before any novel drugs, so I'm talking about novel drugs, I'm not talking about naturally occurring psychedelics. Novel drugs, you have to do a set of studies in animals before you're able to dose them in humans. Um, a classical study is a 4-week repeat dose study in 2 different species. Now, in the clinic, you're not going to give that drug on a daily basis for 4 weeks. So, how do you do a study? Why do you need to do a study which administers a drug in the animal for 4 weeks on a daily basis? So, those are some of the key challenges from a regulatory point of view. And I know there are others from a treatment paradigm or a psychological support point of view, which I'm sure we'll talk briefly about.
Thank you. I think you really clearly described some of the issues that you're facing. And I'm just curious about the tweaks that you kind of mentioned that Cybin's doing to overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah. So basically, even though the regulation is not clear, we know that that is the regulation that will be applicable to the drugs we bring to the market. And Ripke mentioned earlier the draft FDA guidance, which gives us some guardrails around development of drugs which are psychedelics. It's not perfect, and we are going to send back our comments to the FDA, whether they listen to us or not. A similar guidance doesn't exist yet in Europe. What we are doing is we are adapting our programs to fit, and it's not ideal, to fit the guidance that already exists. For example, instead of a randomized withdrawal study, we are planning for a long-term follow-up efficacy study, which could demonstrate whether people benefit in the long term with these drugs. I think the smartest thing we've done is in the non-clinical program, which we've adapted to mimic what will happen in the clinic. So don't give the drug to the animal every day. They won't tolerate it. Mimic the schedule of dosing that you would typically see in the clinic. That's how we've adapted that. We've adapted our clinical trial design in terms of the control groups, in terms of the blinding. We recognize there'll be some functional unblinding, but what we can do is maybe make the assessments, or people who are assessing the patients, we can reduce bias at that end and make them independent. So those are some of the things we are doing. We are still designing our short-term studies, which look at efficacy from 4 to 12 weeks, long-term efficacy up to a year. We'll be following up our patients. And we are looking at potentially building a database of 1,500 patients through not just our internal studies, but collaborative studies with investigators, with academic institutions, so that we are able to file for a successful application.
And so far, with the kind of adjustments that you've made, do you think that the regulator's going to accept those adjustments?
Well, that remains to be seen. We hope and think they will, because we are following the general framework of drug development as prescribed by the EMA or the MHRA and the FDA. So we are sticking to that, well-known formula, if you like, of short-term studies, long-term studies, safety studies, etc.
Perfect. And now we've moved on to a couple of the other challenges that you alluded to in your previous answer. And that is kind of the role of the therapist and kind of what paradigm we fit these drugs into. Can you speak a bit more about those challenges?
Yeah, maybe let's start with the role of the therapist. And I think the psychotherapy or psychological support that's usually associated with psychedelic treatments is unfortunately a bit maligned for the resource-intensive nature of that. this is not uncommon in clinical practice. I don't practice anymore, but when I was seeing patients, when patients go to psychiatrists or clinicians, there often is an element of which is similar to, let's say, preparation. So you are prescribing somebody an antipsychotic. You sit with that patient and explain to them what that drug will do, what they should expect, what are the kind of side effects, how long it will take for some beneficial effects to see. Once they've taken the medication, you debrief with them. You ask them how it's gone, what adaptations they've had to make, how have they responded, etc., which is not unlike what we see with psychedelics. Of course, it's a very simplistic view, but what I'm trying to say is in clinical practice, we do offer patients psychological support. And it is necessary. I'm going to take one quote that you said earlier, that you are stripping people of their maladaptive coping mechanisms. And that can make them really vulnerable. And that, of course, differentiates psychedelics from other treatments. And that also requires that you provide them with some sort of psychological support. Now, the standard paradigm, if you like, of psychological support is some sort of prep work. Then there is a medicine session or a treatment session where you supervise the administration of the drug. There's no therapy happening. It's just the psychologist or the therapist is there, or the clinician is there for safety and reassurance purposes. And then the most important bit, in my view, is after the session, in the days and weeks following, which is where integration takes place, where they try to make sense of what they experienced during the session. There are various protocols out there. For example, a colleague of mine uses the ACT framework. We at Cybin, we've developed the Embark protocol, which is a 6-domain transdiagnostic model of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And we train all our therapists to administer that sort of psychological support. It also ensures that everybody is following the same protocol. It kind of reduces the variability in the data. What we are now doing is trying to optimize it for scaling in large scale studies. In a small study with 30 patients, it's easy to spend a lot of time with the patient. It's easy to find the therapists, which, by the way, is going to be the next bottleneck in clinical trials with psychedelics. At the moment, up until now, it's been finding the patients. But now it's going to be finding the therapists who are adequately qualified to deliver that treatment. So that's something we are doing. And we are optimizing that Embark protocol so that it's leaner, it's much more scalable. We've already got Embark Open Access, which is on a website, which basically anybody can register and go through some basic foundational framework for that treatment.
And yeah, that kind of brings me nicely onto my next question. Kind of as you've alluded to, psychedelics promise a complete overhaul of how we treat patients. It's not taking a drug every day. You kind of have preparation before, you're held during, and you have therapy afterwards. But there's whisperings kind of among the psychedelic investor community that pharma doesn't want to touch anything that's psychedelic-assisted therapy because it doesn't easily scale. And kind of you've alluded to it in your previous answer, but is that a challenge that we need to overcome? Are we overcoming it?
I'm confident we will, because the economics will make sense. They most definitely will make sense. Earlier in the year, I saw some data coming out of the University of Greenwich comparing SSRIs and CBT and the resources you spend in treating a patient with depression, for example, using SSRIs and CBT, which, as you know, that's a drug that needs to be taken daily. For years on end. And if you compare it to, let's say, a psychedelic treatment, which maybe requires 2 sessions or 3 sessions, and even though those sessions may be intensive and may require high amount of resources at that instant, but they are not going to be a constant drain on resources. And by improving people's lives and their symptoms significantly, you contribute to them coming back to work and contributing to the economy. So the economics will definitely make sense.
Thank you. And so kind of scaling back a bit, there's kind of been some recent press around how psychedelics work and kind of different theories. Is another challenge also figuring out how they work, kind of where are we in that process?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation with psychedelics because you are almost reverse engineering the drug trial. Right? Normally, you find a drug and you explore whether it works or not. But based on data from traditional use, underground use, these treatments are likely to work. Um, the there is, of course, a question among the scientific and neuropharmacology community as to how they work. Interestingly, last year I was at a conference in Denver, the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and there was this session on psychedelics, and somebody stood up and said, "Well, it's not just enough to tell us they work. You need to tell us how they work. Only then we will believe you." So there is an onus sense, some responsibility on us to demonstrate how they work. There are theories, of course. There are papers coming out almost every week. More recently, you probably have seen that paper in Nature, which talks about the pathway through which psychedelics may open a window of plasticity, and that's what they do. They open a window of plasticity where people are able to change their maladaptive patterns of thinking, which underlie most of these mental health conditions. What we've got to figure out, though, is, are these going to be treatments which are like one and done? Do you need more than one sort of session? Do you need 2, 3, 4? How many do you need? What should be the interval between 2 sessions? Again, as was being discussed in the previous session, you give somebody a psychedelic like psilocybin. There is a lot of psychological work to do. So how soon are they ready to receive another or undergo another session? Is another session required? Now, when you look at the data from clinical trials that have been completed with psychedelics, there is enough indication in there to show that at least the acute effects maybe start to wane off around 4 or 5 weeks. So that seems to be around roughly the time when you should think of a second administration or a second session, about 3 to 4 weeks. Some patients may not be ready. And we've seen this in our study. Some patients just refuse to get a second dose because they have undergone so much in their first session that they are simply not ready. So that's how we are designing our clinical trials as well at Cybin. We are using a paradigm of 2 treatments, which are about 3 to 4 weeks apart. In some patients, maybe 1 session will be enough. In some, even 2 may not be enough. We will find out.
Definitely. And just to round off, so challenges are also opportunities, and I kind of wanted to finish on a positive note. So what do you think the biggest opportunity is here for psychedelics? What are you most excited about?
Well, as I said, having been in drug development for over 25 years, I've never been so excited. I was outside earlier in the morning at breakfast, and I was speaking to some of my colleagues, and I am as excited as a child right now. even if you don't pay me to work, I will work in this field. Because for the first time in forever,
I'll remember that.
yeah, for the first time, I'm a clinician. I'm a psychiatrist. I have seen firsthand in patients how they struggle, and there's literally treatments. They are symptomatic. They don't do anything to change fundamentally the process that underlie these illnesses, um, and almost all of us have been touched in some way or the other by mental health issues, whether it's in ourselves or in our near and dear ones. And we see them struggle every day. And we've been giving them treatments for almost 50, 60 years now, a daily pill, which doesn't really seem to work very effectively for the vast majority, but we continue to do that. And here's an opportunity which will fundamentally change the way we view and we treat mental illnesses. So I'm really excited about it.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much for all your insights, and we can end there.
Thank you so much.